Hey everyone, welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're diving into something that's been generating a lot of buzz, especially when it comes to planning for retirement. We're talking about gold IRAs.
Yeah, and we're going to unpack it all today based on the Gold IRA Investing Guide 2025 to help you figure out if this is something that might make sense for your retirement plan.
Exactly. So first things first, what exactly are we talking about when we say gold IRA?
Well, you can think of it as a specific type of IRA, a self-directed individual retirement account. But the key here, the big difference, is that instead of just holding stocks or bonds, you can actually have physical precious metals.
Okay, so we're talking actual gold bars and coins, right? Like the real deal.
Exactly. You can hold gold, silver, platinum, palladium, though of course the IRS has some rules about it. The metals have to meet certain purity standards. For gold bullion, for instance, it usually needs to be at least 99.5% pure.
So not just any old gold will do.
Yeah.
Got it. And this whole idea of holding gold in an IRA, this is a relatively recent thing, right?
Right. It became possible thanks to the Taxpayer Relief Act of 1997. That's when the IRS started allowing for these self-directed IRAs to hold precious metals.
Now, you keep saying self-directed. I think that's a really important piece for our listeners to understand. What does that actually mean for someone looking at their retirement options?
A self-directed IRA basically gives you more control, more flexibility over what you invest in within that IRA. So while we're focusing on precious metals today, you could technically have a mix of traditional assets, like stocks and bonds, alongside alternative investments.
So it's about having more options, a more diversified portfolio within that retirement account.
Exactly. Though, again, our focus today is going to be on those precious metals, especially gold, within a gold IRA.
And that's what we're going to try to break down today using the Gold IRA Investing Guide 2025 as our roadmap. We're going to try to cut through the jargon and figure out if a gold IRA is something you should seriously consider, especially because we know that a lot of people are looking for more control, more security when it comes to planning for their financial future.
Yeah, that's definitely something we're seeing more and more of. We've seen a real shift in the way retirement benefits work these days. Traditional company pensions, they're becoming less common, and individuals are having to take more responsibility for their own retirement planning.
So it makes sense that people are looking at different options, different ways to approach retirement. And gold IRAs seem to be gaining a lot of traction. What's driving this growing interest in holding gold as part of your retirement strategy?
I'd say one of the biggest factors is the idea of diversification. I mean, the old adage, don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Right, spread the risk.
Yeah. And the guide highlights this by referencing studies that show historically gold has had a low correlation with, say, the S&P 500. Meaning, when the stock market takes a big dip, gold doesn't necessarily follow suit. It often moves in a different direction, maybe even goes up in value. So it can act as a kind of counterbalance in your portfolio. Bonds are often seen as that counterweight to stocks.
Right, they're supposed to provide some stability when the stock market is going haywire.
Exactly. And the guide is saying that precious metals, especially gold, can play a similar role, potentially even more effectively in some cases.
It can be a hedge, a way to protect yourself against the ups and downs of the market, and especially those unexpected economic storms we all know can happen.
Exactly. That's one of the big selling points of a gold IRA, the peace of mind that it can offer. Think about it. If you're nearing retirement or already retired, the idea of not having to constantly watch the market, that can be really appealing.
Yeah, being able to sleep at night without worrying about your nest egg shrinking is a huge benefit for many people. So let's get into why gold specifically. The guide goes into quite a bit of detail about why investors choose gold, why it's seen as such a valuable asset. What are some of the key points that our listeners should be aware of?
One of the things that stands out is the fact that there's just a consistent high demand for gold. It's used in so many different industries, electronics, jewelry, industrial applications. And this demand is especially strong in rapidly growing economies like China and India.
So it's not just a shiny thing that people like, it actually has real-world uses driving its value.
Exactly. And the guide makes the point that as these economies continue to develop, the demand for gold is only going to increase. But that's just one side of the coin. What's really interesting is gold's role as a potential hedge against inflation.
Okay, so how does that work? Because inflation is a real concern for a lot of people, especially when it comes to retirement savings.
Well, unlike currencies like the US dollar, the supply of gold is finite. You can't just print more of it. It's a tangible asset. And the guide explains that this limited supply is what makes gold such a good hedge against inflation and currency devaluation. Historically, gold has tended to hold its value even when currencies fluctuate.
So in theory, if the value of the dollar goes down, the value of gold could go up, or at least stay more stable.
That's the idea. It's important to note that it's not a perfect hedge in every scenario. The guide does mention periods of, for example, what's called stagflation, where gold's performance was a little more complicated. But the general idea is that it helps protect your purchasing power in the long run.
So it's a more reliable store of value, potentially, than just having cash sitting in a bank account?
Potentially, yes. And the guide also makes another interesting point. Gold's value isn't necessarily tied to the performance of the overall economy. So even in times of economic downturns or recessions, the value of gold can actually increase.
So when things are looking bad, people flock to gold as a safe haven.
Right. And over the long term, historically, it's tended to increase in value steadily. It might not be a get-rich-quick scheme, but it's often seen as a dependable way to preserve your wealth, which is, of course, very important for retirement planning.
And what about during times of real crisis? Like major geopolitical events or financial meltdowns. The guide actually refers to gold as a crisis commodity.
Yeah, this is a really interesting point. Whenever there's a lot of instability, uncertainty, whether it's political, economic, or global, people tend to flock to gold. It's seen as a stable asset in times of turmoil.
So it's almost like an insurance policy for your portfolio.
That's a good way to put it. And finally, we can't forget about the liquidity aspect. Gold is relatively easy to buy and sell. There are various ways to invest in it: ETFs, stocks, derivatives. And of course, with the Gold IRA, you're holding the physical bullion, which, especially in the form of gold coins, can be readily converted to cash if needed.
So you've got options, different ways to access your investment. Now, the guide also spent some time talking about silver, why the focus on silver in addition to gold.
It seems like there's a growing trend of investors who, when they start looking into gold IRAs, they end up also adding silver to their portfolio. The guide delves deeper into the potential of silver, the different types of silver investments, and the global market for silver.
And there's even an expert prediction mentioned in the guide, something about a potential surge in silver prices coming up.
Yeah, they're predicting a potential 20% increase in silver's value by 2025. So it's clearly catching the attention of investors alongside gold.
Okay, so lots to consider there.
Yeah.
But let's get down to the nitty-gritty. What are the core advantages of having these precious metals, particularly gold, within a gold IRA, as opposed to just buying gold coins or bars outright?
The fundamental advantage, the one the guide really emphasizes, is that with a gold IRA, you have direct ownership of that physical gold bullion. You're not buying shares in a company or a mutual fund. You actually own those gold bars or coins. And the guide makes it clear that the price of that physical gold is tied directly to the spot price, which is essentially the current market price for an ounce of gold.
So it's like owning a piece of that actual commodity.
Exactly. And as we talked about before, the guide highlights that long-term stability of gold prices, historically speaking. It tends to increase in value over time, making it potentially a suitable investment for retirement.
And of course, being an IRA, there are tax implications. Are those spelled out in the guide as well?
Oh, yeah, for sure. They point out that one of the main benefits of having a gold IRA is the potential tax advantages. So while you will eventually pay taxes on your gains, typically when you start taking distributions in retirement, the tax rates associated with gold held as a capital asset within an IRA, they're generally lower.
So there's a potential tax efficiency aspect as well.
Right. And the guide also mentions that under certain circumstances, you might be able to avoid those early withdrawal penalties that typically come with IRAs. Like, for instance, if you have certain medical expenses or are making a first-time home purchase, you might be able to access those funds early without penalty.
Okay, so definitely some tax benefits to consider there. Now, setting up a gold IRA, I'm guessing it's a little bit more involved than just opening a regular IRA at your local bank, right? Can you walk us through what that process looks like based on the guide so our listeners know what to expect?
Yeah, it's definitely a bit more specialized. The guide breaks it down and emphasizes that often the easiest way to set up a Gold IRA is to transfer funds from an existing retirement plan, like a 401k from a previous employer. And they talk about the IRA rollover process.
Right, so rolling over that 401k into this new type of account.
Exactly. And they make the point that if you've already left the company sponsoring that 401k, the rollover can actually be quite simple.
So it's not necessarily a complicated process.
Not always. But there's one thing to keep in mind, and the guide highlights this. You want to be clear on whether you're doing a rollover or a transfer. They're not quite the same thing.
What's the difference?
A rollover is when you get a check made out to you personally, and then you have a limited time to deposit that money into the new Gold IRA. A transfer is when the funds move directly between the accounts without you ever actually holding that money. And the guide points out that there can be tax implications depending on which method you choose.
So you definitely want to get good advice on that front. Now, what about costs? Are there specific fees associated with Gold IRAs that people should be aware of?
Yeah, there are a few things to watch out for. The guide outlines those typical fees. There's usually a one-time seller's fee, sometimes called a setup fee. It varies depending on the company you choose. Then there are annual custodian fees. Remember those custodians we were talking about? They're required by the government for these accounts, and they charge a fee for their services.
So those annual custodian fees, those are just something you have to factor in.
Yeah, they're usually unavoidable. And then there are the annual storage fees. You can't just keep those gold bars under your mattress. You have to store them in an IRS-approved depository.
So it's not just about the price of gold. It's also about the ongoing costs of maintaining that Gold IRA.
Right. You got to keep that in mind. Now, the guide does point out that some companies will waive those first-year admin and storage fees as an incentive to sign up with them. And they also stress the importance of understanding whether a company charges flat rates or scaled rates for those annual fees.
Scaled rates meaning?
Meaning they take a percentage of your holdings every year. So if your account grows, those fees grow too. It's important to understand that difference because it can really affect your overall returns.
So there's a real due diligence aspect here, making sure you understand those fees and charges before you commit.
Absolutely.
And you mentioned IRS-approved storage. That sounds like a crucial element of all this.
It's mandatory, actually. The guide emphasizes that if you have a Gold IRA, those metals have to be stored in an IRS-approved depository until you reach age 59 and a half. You can't keep them at home.
Makes sense. So how does that work?
Well, the guide touches on the different types of storage options. There's segregated storage, where your specific bars or coins are kept separate. And then there's commingled storage, where they're stored together with other investors' metals of the same type. There's also allocated storage, where you own specific, identifiable bars, and non-allocated storage, which is kind of like owning a share in a pool of gold.
So different levels of ownership and separation. And I'm guessing the fees vary depending on the type of storage you choose.
Right. The guide goes into more detail about those options, but it's definitely something to consider.
So you've got these custodians, these depositories. It seems like setting up and managing a Gold IRA can be pretty complex. That's where these Gold IRA companies come in, right? The guide talks about working with them.
Yeah, exactly. They basically act as facilitators, as a one-stop shop. They help you set up the account, handle all the paperwork, work with the custodian on your behalf, and even assist with purchasing those precious metals. They help you navigate the whole process.
So it takes some of the complexity out of the equation for the average investor.
Yeah, that's the idea. And they're supposed to be experts in retirement planning, familiar with all the IRS regulations and requirements. They usually have preferred custodians they work with, but as the guide points out, you, as the investor, can often choose your own custodian if you prefer.
So you do have some say in the matter. But it sounds like having a Gold IRA company handle the details can make things a lot smoother. But of course, with so many companies out there, how do you choose the right one?
That's a great question. The guide offers some really good advice on that front.
I'm all ears. What should our listeners be looking for?
First and foremost, you want to look for a company with a strong reputation and experience in the field. You want to see a proven track record, real testimonials from satisfied customers, and a reputation for fairness and transparency.
So do your research. Check those online reviews.
Absolutely. And then, of course, fees. Always pay close attention to the fees. The guide recommends choosing companies with flat fee structures whenever possible, rather than plans with a bunch of hidden costs that can sneak up on you later.
Transparency is key.
Absolutely. And you want a company that's flexible, that can tailor their plans to your individual needs and goals, regardless of how much money you're investing.
So make sure they're listening to your specific situation, not just trying to shoehorn you into a one-size-fits-all plan. Is there a way to kind of vet these companies from an outside perspective, get a sense of how reliable they are?
The guide recommends checking with some of those consumer watchdog organizations, like the Better Business Bureau, TrustLink, and the Business Consumer Alliance. They keep track of complaints and how well companies respond to them.
So it's a good way to see if they have a history of good customer service and ethical practices.
Exactly.
Okay, good to know. And what about the custodian they use? Should you be paying attention to that?
Definitely. The guide says to look into the custodial details. You want to know whether their storage fees are scaled or flat, how quickly they process orders, what storage options they offer, how they handle transfers, what their security protocols are, and, maybe most importantly, how easy it is to communicate with them if you have questions or concerns.
So clear communication and transparency are important on all fronts.
Absolutely. And then there's the customer service aspect. The guide emphasizes that the best companies will have a really responsive, knowledgeable, and experienced customer service team. People who can walk you through the whole process and answer all your questions.
So you don't feel like you're just dealing with a faceless corporation.
Exactly.
And the guide actually names its top 3 recommended Gold IRA companies: Augusta, Precious Metals, Gold Co., and American Hartford Gold. They specifically mention that Augusta has 0 complaints with the Better Business Bureau and the Business Consumer Alliance.
Right. They highlight those companies as good starting points for your research based on the criteria they've laid out.
So there you have it. Lots to think about. What are the key takeaways from all this for our listeners who are considering a Gold IRA as part of their retirement plan?
Well, the guide makes it clear that Gold IRAs are becoming increasingly popular. There's a growing sense that they offer a way to protect those hard-earned retirement funds from economic uncertainty. But, and this is a big but, choosing the right company to work with is absolutely crucial. You've got to do your due diligence and really research those companies.
Because there are risks, right?
Yeah, definitely. If you end up with an unreliable company, you could be hit with high fees, pushy salespeople, problems with the custodian, poor service, you name it.
So buyer beware.
Exactly. But on the flip side, if you choose wisely, a Gold IRA does offer the potential to protect your savings from some of those big risks that we all worry about, market crashes, currency devaluation, inflation, that kind of thing.
And it all comes back to that idea of diversification, not having all your eggs in one basket, right?
Yeah, right. Having a portion of your retirement savings in a tangible asset like gold that's historically held its value in tough times, that can provide some real peace of mind.
So for our listeners, as you're thinking about your own retirement goals and your risk tolerance, ask yourself, how do the potential benefits and risks of a Gold IRA fit into your overall financial picture? And we encourage you to check out the Gold IRA Investing Guide 2025 for more details on those specific companies and storage options we talked about. It's a great resource. Knowledge is power, folks. Make those informed decisions. Thanks for diving in with us.